Okay, so are you ready to dive into this? Because today we are talking all about comics.
A deep dive into comics. I like it.
We're going to figure out not just like what we think of as comics, but where those ideas came from, how different cultures all over the world have shaped these awesome stories.
Mm.
And we've got some really interesting stuff to look at today.
Yeah, we're talking cave paintings to superheroes. It's wild how something so simple can actually be so complex when you really get into it.
I know, right? Like, I always thought I knew what a comic was, but then you read something like this Wikipedia article, and right off the bat it says there's no one definition that everyone agrees on.
It's true. And it's kind of funny when you think about it
It is. It really is.
because it gets at something like essential about how we understand stories.
Hmm.
Like think about cave paintings, right? Egyptian hieroglyphs, even like the Bayeux tapestry. They're using images in a sequence to tell a story. And those were around way before the word comic ever existed.
So are those comics then? Where does that word even come from anyway?
Well, and why are they called comic books when they're not always like funny?
Right.
It's really interesting because the word, it sticks around even as the art form changes, you know?
Yeah.
So comics, that term, it comes from those early like humorous newspapers, the funny pages in America. We'll talk about the Yellow Kid a bit later, which is one of the most famous. But the point is, as the medium grew, it started to embrace all these different genres, drama, horror, you name it. But comic book, it just stuck as this catch-all term even when the stories got really serious.
Kind of like how we still say films and most movies aren't on film anymore.
Yeah, exactly. The name, it like captures a moment in time, you know?
Yeah.
But the art form, it just keeps changing.
So speaking of the Yellow Kid, the article mentions that one a lot. What's so special about that? It was just in newspapers, right?
It was huge for its time, though. Late 1800s, early 1900s, this was when newspaper comics were super popular, especially in America. And Richard Outcault, he was the guy who created it. And he was experimenting with all these new things like speech bubbles, sequential panels. He was literally shaping how we see comics today.
Wow, so that's like the great-granddaddy of modern comics.
In a lot of ways, yeah. It's directly related to those Sunday funnies you still see in the paper. But what's interesting is that at the same time this was all happening in America, you had a totally different thing developing over in Europe.
Oh, yeah. The article did mention something about how European comics had their own thing going on. What was different about them?
Picture this. You've got these beautifully drawn full-color albums, often with longer, kind of more literary stories. They were like the graphic novels of their time. One of the early pioneers was this Swiss artist, Rodolphe Töpfer, and get this, he was working back in the 1820s, that's before the Yellow Kid.
I had no idea comics went back that far in Europe.
Wow. So you've got these two different traditions developing basically on opposite sides of the world. But were they influencing each other at all?
Oh, totally. There were always ideas bouncing back and forth across the Atlantic. Like in Britain, you had Amalgamated Press, and they were really cranking out these publications in the late 1800s. Illustrated chips, comic cuts that were incredibly popular. And the format is shockingly similar to what we now call comic books.
So those were like the missing link between those big newspaper comics and then the like thinner comic books that we're used to.
Yeah, exactly. They were laying the groundwork. And this was all happening alongside the rise of those satirical magazines,
Hmm.
in both Europe and America. Punch, for example. That's actually where we get the word cartoon.
Wait, really? Cartoon comes from Punch magazine? I always thought it was from like animation.
It's funny how a word can change its meaning like that.
Sure. But getting back to the format itself, even back then, you'd have these single panel cartoons, and sometimes they would actually appear in a sequence, right? Like multiple panels building up a joke and in a way experimenting with how to tell a story visually.
So even before the format existed, people were still driven by that, like that storytelling instinct.
Right, exactly. And one really early example that the article mentions is Alley Sloper. I don't know if you've heard of this one.
I don't think so.
But this British character, it actually gets its own weekly magazine in 1884, even earlier than a lot of the American newspaper strips we think of.
1884.
That's incredible.
Okay, so we've got Europe figuring out the early forms of what we know as comic books. America is all about the newspaper strips. What about Japan during all this? Were they already into manga?
Manga.
Hmm.
That is a whole fascinating story in and of itself, and it goes back centuries.
Okay, before we go too far down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
I want to loop back to something we were talking about earlier, those really, really old examples of sequential art, like cave paintings, hieroglyphs, even tapestries. Are those really comics, though, or is that more like a comparison?
You know, That is actually a question that is still being debated today. It gets to the heart of what even makes a comic in the first place. I mean, are cave paintings telling stories with images? Yes. But were they using established comic book conventions? Not really.
So they're more like the ancient ancestors.
Hmm.
It shows us where those impulses to tell stories visually come from in the first place.
That's a really great way to put it, actually. And I think more than just recognizing like a historical connection, it also helps us to appreciate how many different things can fall under the umbrella of comics. We haven't even touched on graphic novels yet.
Oh, right. From underground comics to, like, Menace. That's a whole other chapter, or should I say issue.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, I do want to go back to early American comics for a second. We talked about the Yellow Kid a bit, but the article mentions some other big names, too. What about Mutt and Jeff? Does that one ring a bell?
Mutt and Jeff is a classic. It debuted in 1907, I believe, and it was one of the most popular daily comic strips. This was a time when, like, those shorter black and white strips started appearing next to the big, colorful Sunday comics in the newspapers.
So Mutt and Jeff, they were like the rock stars of those daily comics.
Yeah, pretty much.
But did they change the kinds of stories that comics were telling?
Oh, for sure. Those daily strips, they brought something totally new. A different kind of humor, a faster pace.
They had to grab your attention.
Exactly. You only have a few panels to work with, so you got to get in there, get the joke across, and get out. It's like
the Twitter of its day.
huh.
Yeah.
That's a great comparison. Come to think of it, the way that social media changed how we take in information, those daily strips, they kind of did the same thing for comics. They paved the way for the comic book.
Oh, right. We were talking about those earlier British publications, and they sort of looked like comic books. But the golden age of comics, that was a purely American thing, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, those earlier publications definitely laid the groundwork, but the 1930s, that's when the comic book as we know it was really born.
And that was because of superheroes, right? I mean, you can't talk about the golden age without mentioning Superman.
It all goes back to Superman, Action Comics, 1938, boom, everything changes.
That's so crazy to think about.
It really is.
Because before Superman, comics were seen as like this light entertainment.
Totally.
And then suddenly you have this character dealing with all these like serious issues, anxieties about society, and it just blew up and became this huge cultural thing.
And he really kicked off a whole new era. After Superman, you had Batman, Wonder Woman, Captain America, all these bigger-than-life characters dealing with real-world problems, But obviously in this heightened, fantastical kind of way.
Yeah, it's like Greek mythology,
Oh.
but for the modern world. But it wasn't just superheroes back then, right? They had other kinds of comics in the golden age, too.
Oh, yeah, tons. Romance, crime, horror, westerns, you name it, they had it. And they weren't just fluff pieces either. They tackled real issues, reflecting what it was like back then with the war and everything.
That's really interesting because you'd think with everything going on in the world at that time, those kinds of stories would be even more appealing to readers.
You would think so.
But wasn't there, like, a backlash? Against comics, I mean.
Yeah, there was. After the war, people started getting really worried about comics, especially the crime and horror ones. Parents thought they were bad for their kids, and things came to a head in the 50s with those Senate hearings about the dangers of comics.
Oh, right. The Comics Code. That was a big turning point for the industry, wasn't it? Basically, comics started censoring themselves.
Yep.
That's exactly what happened. The Comics Code Authority, it came about in '54, and it just laid down the law about what you could and couldn't show in a comic. Anything too violent, too sexy, too subversive, gone.
It seems kind of counterproductive now when you think about it.
Well, I mean, they were trying to protect the kids, right?
Right,
But it really stifled the creativity.
for sure. Did that have a lasting effect, though, the Comics Code, I mean?
Oh, absolutely. It had a huge impact. Some would even say it led to like a creative slump for American comics.
Yeah.
Everything got really formulaic,
Yeah.
Same old stories, same simple characters. It was a bit of a drag, honestly. It wasn't until underground comics came along in the late 60s, early 70s that things started to change.
Oh, yeah, the underground comics movement. That was all about rebellion, right? Pushing the limits of what comics could be.
100%. Suddenly you had comics talking about sexuality, drugs, politics. It was raw, it was edgy, and it really changed the game. And that led to the alternative comics movement of the 80s. And that's when we see the rise of the graphic novel as its own distinct thing, right? Longer stories, more complex themes.
Yep. It wasn't just the format that was different. It was how people saw comics. People were starting to take them seriously. They were being taught in universities, winning literary awards. It was a whole new ballgame.
It's amazing how far comics have come since the Yellow Kid. But all this time, while American comics were going through these changes, what was happening over in the manga world, I talked about that a little earlier, but I'm really interested to hear more about it.
Oh man, manga is a whole other story. It's just as fascinating with its own history, traditions, innovations,
Right.
going back centuries. Remember when we were talking about those really early examples of sequential art, like cave paintings?
Mhm.
Well, in Japan, you can trace those same impulses, that visual storytelling, back to things like the ukiyo-e woodblock prints of the Edo period.
Oh, right. Those prints were incredible. Everyday life, landscapes, beautiful women, all these amazing details.
Yeah.
And it's cool how you can see that same sensibility in a lot of manga today.
Totally. That attention to detail, those expressive lines, it's like capturing a whole world in a single image. And just like ukiyo-e prints reflected what was going on at the time, manga became really big after World War II.
And then there's Osamu Tezuka,
Ah,
the
yes.
godfather of
The
manga.
god of manga. He was unbelievably influential. Astro Boy, Kimba the White Lion, Blackjack. He created some of the most iconic manga series of all time.
And those stories, they weren't just popular in Japan. They, like, broke through those cultural barriers.
She really did.
All over the world, people were reading his manga, watching the anime adaptations. His influence is immeasurable.
He was a visionary, there's no doubt about it. He just understood the power of visual storytelling, and he was constantly pushing the boundaries of what comics could do, experimenting with panel layouts, bringing in cinematic techniques. I mean, his stories were dealing with technology, humanity, the future.
It's interesting, right? Because you have American comics and manga, both developing in their own ways, but both grappling with these big universal questions.
Exactly. It just shows you how powerful comics can be as a medium. Whether it's Superman fighting for justice or a giant robot in Tokyo trying to figure out what it means to be alive, these stories resonate with us because they speak to something fundamental about being human.
It's that emotional connection that makes comics so special.
Yes.
And I think that's easy to forget sometimes, especially with people who still think comics are just for kids.
Oh, tell me about it. But luckily, that's changing slowly but surely. We were talking about graphic novels and the fact that there are now actual academics studying comics.
Right? Comic
It's
studies.
finally getting the recognition it deserves as a complex art form.
It's so great to see comics being taken seriously like that.
I know, it's about time.
But it's not just about appreciating comics as a whole, you know what I mean? It's about
Yeah.
understanding how they actually work. Like, we keep mentioning panels, but there's got to be more to it than just, like, boxes with pictures, right?
Yeah. You'd be surprised how much you can do with a box with a picture. I mean, the size and shape of the panel, how they're arranged on the page, even the space between them, it all matters. It changes how we experience the story, the pacing, the mood, everything.
Oh, right. The space between the panels. Isn't that what they call the gutter?
The gutter, yes. It's like the secret weapon that comics have.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at these still images, frozen moments, but our brains naturally want to fill in the gaps, right? And that creates a sense of movement, of time passing.
So we're basically animating the story in our heads.
Exactly. The artist is guiding us, of course, but they leave just enough space for us to, like, use our imaginations. A wider gutter, for example, that could mean a bigger jump in time, and that creates mystery, anticipation. Or you have these rapid fire panels all bunched up together, and that can make things really intense, like your heart is pounding.
It's like they say in filmmaking, show, don't tell. But with comics, it's more like show a little, let the reader fill in the rest.
That's a great way to put it. And then you've got all the other stuff. Speech bubbles, even those can change how a line is read just by messing with the shape, the size, the lettering.
Oh, and sound effects. Don't even get me started on sound effects, especially the ones that break out of the panel. So cool.
The classic boom, cap. They're like visual onomatopoeia, they bring in a whole other sense to the experience.
It makes you wonder how they figured all that stuff out in the first place. Did those early comic artists have it all planned out? Or was it more like they were just trying things out and seeing what worked?
It was probably a little of both. But if you look at how those techniques evolved, from the early speech balloons and newspapers to the way someone like Tezuka uses the medium, it's like each generation was building on the one before it, always pushing the boundaries of what comics could be.
And now we're at a point where there are people who study this stuff for a living,
It's true.
analyzing those choices that artists make, like it's any other art form.
Which is as it should be. It just goes to show you comics are more than just entertainment, you know? They're this lens that we can use to understand all sorts of things.
Mm.
History, culture, even psychology.
Wow. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about how far comics have come. I mean, we're talking about everything from cave paintings to graphic novels that win Pulitzer Prizes.
It's a pretty incredible journey.
It really is. But you know what's crazy?
What's that?
With all the analysis and historical context, at the end of the day, it's still just about opening a comic book and getting lost in the story.
That's the magic of it, right? It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. Anyone can pick up a comic and connect with it.
Exactly. So if you're listening to this and you haven't checked out the world of comics lately, I highly recommend it. You might be surprised by what you find. And that, my friends, is a wrap on our deep dive into comics. Thanks for joining us.